Hey everyone, this is the Kubernetes SIG Testing meeting for August 28th. This is going to be recorded and hopefully posted to YouTube at some point in the future. I have thrown the meeting notes link into the chat. I'll throw it in there one more time. Somebody wants to volunteer to note take, that would be amazing. Catherine, you've got the first item on the agenda today, end-to-end testing code coverage. Take it away.
Okay, sure. So I guess I sent out a few days ago this proposal where we would start instrumenting some components so that we could collect code coverage information from them when the end-to-end conformance tests were run. I'm not sure I have a lot more to add. Don't really know what to say about that, other than it would be great if people could look at it and give feedback if they are so inclined.
One of the questions that I had reading this, because I think somebody mentioned something about non-V1 APIs. Do we want to limit this just to the conformance suite? Why do we not want to measure coverage from alpha APIs and whatnot?
So our use case is covering the conformance suite. There is nothing inherent to the implementation that requires it be restricted to conformance suite. It is simply why we're building this right now. If we want to expand the coverage or run it in other cases, then that would work okay.
I think it was more so about that the coverage tests, conformance tests I think currently are only expected to target GA APIs. So you might want to be able to extract the coverage somehow, ignoring those. You're not interested in that part of the code, possibly.
And so how are you going to measure which files, the denominator for the percentage?
That is fuzzy at the moment.
We've talked about it a little bit. It seems like possibly you would need different metrics. I don't know that we can necessarily require any of them. It's more of this would be a useful tool for figuring out what else we should add coverage to.
Okay.
I don't think anyone's proposing that we add any hard requirements on this yet. Maybe at some you might want some kind of regression of okay, well, we lost 50% coverage, this is bad.
Right. Relative testing or relative changes should be reasonable. Okay. Anybody else on the call read through the proposal, have any comments? Did the other question I think got brought up here, did any of the Google Go maintainers have any comments on the use of that technically not supported API from GoTest?
Besides a general indication that they are interested in, at some point, providing a less technically internal way to do it, not more.
Okay, but it seems stable enough that it's not an issue.
It hasn't changed for 2 years. Bazel uses exactly the same API for similar reasons. So.
Yeah, hopefully most of these internal things shouldn't change too much without surprising us, because we are in the same position with the rules Go stuff. Since it compiles Go very granularly, it reaches into some of those internals as well.
Cool. So I guess anybody else on the call, if you're interested, go ahead and read through that and leave some comments. Ben, you're next on the agenda, demoing the kind.
Okay, I'm going to attempt to screen share. Okay. So I was going to demo a lot more, and then I realized that I'm on a laptop and some of these things are slow, like building Kubernetes. So I pre-built an image earlier, and I'm just going to show really quick. This is what it would look like, but I'm not actually going to let it all run. So you can install it from Test Infra. The goal of this is testing Kubernetes, somewhat integration initially. Obviously, this is not a perfect real cluster, but I'm targeting the conformance suite initially. It'd probably also be fairly useful for really basic workloads integrating against it. So what we've done is we're running something that looks an awful lot like a normal Debian-ish Kubernetes install, but in Docker containers instead of VMs. Because we can use this in CI and because they boot very quickly, and we have good tooling for building a self-contained-ish image. And we're going to work to make it more self-contained. I should add briefly, there are other projects that are similar. There's Minikube, but it doesn't really target building Kubernetes or testing it. It's more of an integrate against it using a VM. It also doesn't do multiple nodes, which is something we're very interested in targeting. There is one other local one that does do multiple nodes, actually two. One requires systemd, which is a bit of a blocker. We don't really want to pass through the host systemd, and that's going to be interesting to make possible for Mac users, whereas with Docker, we can make that work. It's also not an official project, but it is conformant. The other one is Kubernetes Dend cluster, which is in Bash and does some interesting things with only using the hypercube binary, which gives it a much faster iteration time, but a much lower fidelity, I guess, emulation of the Kubernetes cluster because, for example, it doesn't build any of the control plane images. It just tries to like hack them to use this new binary. So with this one, you can do kind build base to build the static base image. We won't really change that. It just includes components that you need for running Kubernetes, various packages that are expected. Also packages that are used as part of the build, like rsync. Then you can build a node image. So when you build a node image, we have installing from apt, which is actually fast enough that I should do a build. And so that will install the upstream packages instead of doing a build. We also have the Bazel build and the local make build, which looks something like quick release, but is skipping a few targets because we don't, for example, need the test walls. So I'm going to kill that. It's slow on the laptop. So after that, you can create a cluster. Here we go. So it's going to take the image that is built that has the Kubernetes binaries and images in it. Right now, what it's doing is it's preloading all of the images, which are baked in the image, which is a lot slower because I'm on battery power in Zoom, but normally it takes about 40 seconds or so to do this. So it does that. You can see these are all the images that are preloaded here. And then it will run kubeatom init, doing a few things to make that work properly. And once you're done, and a bit longer here, it's going to pull the other images that are not built. Currently, that's etcd and core DNS, because those are not part of the Kubernetes build, really. And we use stable images for that. So it's picked up those. It's booting the rest of the cluster. When it's done, it will put a kubeconfig close to where normal kubeconfig would be. So home kube, and then it will generate a file name depending on the cluster name. You can have multiple clusters running with this. And when it's done, it will spit out something for you to run to gain access to the cluster. And I have a cluster. That takes, just on a laptop, it's under a minute to boot a cluster, even on like battery power. It's a bit longer if you do the apt one because it has to pull more of the images. I'm planning to add pre-pulling for all those and more configuration for changing kubeatom config or tuning various things about the cluster. So after this, I've been able to do things like get all the pods, and it works as a cluster. And teardown is also more hermetic and quick because it's a local cluster. It's just a Docker container. Oops, not kubectl delete. So now it's gone. And you can also do, say, a second cluster with a different name. So we're hoping that this will work pretty well for testing. Like I said, the main thing is that it actually builds something that looks like a Kubernetes release. It builds all of the images. In the Bazel case, it actually builds the Debians and installs those. In the make case, it builds the binaries, puts those in, and then it puts in the system unit files as well. And then it configures and runs a cluster. And so far, the fidelity's been pretty good. It generally passes conformance tests. Occasionally, some of the serial ones aren't working. I'm not sure why yet. There's a few more things that need changing. I think probably it's just a Docker graph storage needs more space. James Monolith filed an issue about this morning. So if anybody has any questions or thoughts, I'd be very...
Oh, go ahead, sorry. I had a question about I made a note of it on the notes. So you said you're using kubeadm. So this, I guess, is limited to certain types of cluster deployments. So not multi-master then, just, I guess, one controller node, one worker node?
Multi-master is in my to-do. kubeadm is actually working on HA multi-master support.
I saw a blog a couple months, like it's in the works, but it didn't seem.
It's not ready yet. And the other thing is that's a bit interesting for any sort of local cluster, because now you need to do something like maybe run a DNS server to point to the masters. Or
you know, I'm going to make a note. Actually, we have
It's not doing multiple nodes yet either. However, we know that that's feasible. And this is sort of an extension of, there's another directory in test infra, DIND, that has some local cluster stuff there. Basically, this takes a lot of the same ideas, moves almost all the code into Go and out of Bash, and does some other cleanup and gives you configuration and multiple clusters and things like that. But I have not ported multiple nodes yet.
Okay. I'm just gonna add a link to the notes. I just recently did the multi-master by running core DNS on the controller nodes. It probably won't be directly applicable to this, but it's at least something to.
So this is currently running core DNS because that's what's GA, and I'm using Kubernetes versions because, like I said, another thing about this is we're only targeting testing really. So we're not interested in supporting like old Kubernetes releases. We want to support the stable Kubernetes versions.
The other two questions I had were, does this grab any bits from the public buckets, and does this grab any cache bits from public builds? Because that was a pretty quick build.
So the one build was, I actually killed because it's on a laptop and it's worse.
But you said it still only takes a couple of minutes on battery, so it's not building from scratch, is it?
Booting only takes.
Oh, sorry, I misunderstood.
Building can take, the make build I think takes about 5 minutes on power, 4 or 5 minutes. The Bazel build I'm currently not doing because there are some Mac issues at the moment that we're waiting to fix. Jeff is working on that, and I've been testing against head largely. It also has a pretty quick build because it grabs the packages that are in the standard apt repository and installs those as one of the options, so we can test the actually released bits.
Gotcha, thank you.
That one boots slower, like I said, because it's not pre-pulling the images yet. Another goal for this is at some point to support fully offline, because kubeadm's got pretty good for that, and we can pre-pack all of the images into this and preload them, and that should cut flakes a lot. Almost all of the flakes in CI are related to network usage. So this keeps the network usage a minimum.
On the multi-clusters, was that concurrent?
Yeah, it runs multiple clusters concurrently. It does not, however, currently run multiple nodes per cluster.
And when you're saying that this is targeting testing only, like what sort of restrictions do you have on the cluster that people should know? Like, are there workloads that are not going to work?
It's not going to work for things that you would actually expect a cloud controller manager for. So like when we run tests on GCE, we have stuff like a default disk provisioner, and you can test things like provisioning a disk. Right,
because there's no PV source in it.
Right, or like ingress. There's a whole class of things like that that just don't really make sense for any sort of local cluster. No matter how you build it, it's just never going to really work well. This is going to be pretty good for like, I want to make sure that the API server does the things it should. I want to make sure that the components talk to each other properly.
And are there
also been testing things like that we don't have good tooling for, like mixing Kubernetes versions, building some nodes on one version and some nodes on another version. Classes of tests that like possibly aren't worth it if we have to boot real machines, but are still testable. You just need something that looks like a Kubernetes.
right? And what are there like weird failure modes? Like sometimes with D&D, there's ways that you can corrupt your host or graph storage afterwards. Like,
I mean, so like if you were to schedule a privileged container on this, you could probably do some terrible stuff. But that would be true of a real cluster as well.
Right.
It's just on your workstation. I haven't seen any too bad so far. I mean, so like for example, it's actually running a Docker in Docker. So the trade-off there is that it's running a privileged container, but it is not touching your host Docker, other than to create the containers at the top level that are each node. Inside the node, it's running its own Docker, and it's about as isolated as you could get. VMs would certainly be better, but the tooling's not as good, and they're not really an option for us on Crowd right now.
are there any issues if there's a version mismatch between host Docker and the Docker inside?
That shouldn't be a problem because they're not talking to each other.
Okay.
It's
Ben, I played with kubeadm much recently, but speaking of Docker version mismatch, I noticed that it doesn't seem to always keep up with the more recent builds of Docker. Is that any concern, or is it just basically treat that as a warning?
So Kubernetes as a project doesn't do this currently, but I am also using the version of Docker that is recommended within the container, and that's the one that the tests are actually running against.
Okay, so you've got that installed locally.
That is something else that we'd like to test. As sort of a low fidelity test of these things, I really like to get containerd by itself, cryo by itself, running in the container, because then we can do test matrix things of like, here's a really quick test of here's a cluster that's running against these other runtimes. Most of the problems that I've seen with those are not related to like screwy host things. Runtimes like cryo and containerd are already testing like, hey, this works on Linux. But there's parts of the integration between Kubernetes and things like, oh, it's using the wrong socket path that become an actual problem.
Yeah, I ran into that issue when trying to do my own containerd on CoreOS. It was causing because of all the default values, it was actually defaulting to the built-in version, such to cryo.
Another one that I'd like to help with, and I've been trying to help with, the one that uses Kubernetes DEND cluster, is Ipv6 testing, which is here for. Cisco has some folks that have been working on testing Ipv6, and local clusters are their best option at the moment because we don't have quota anywhere that has actual Ipv6 nodes, but we can turn on Ipv6 within the network namespace inside the container and run it.
Yeah, so Ben, when you start up a node, is there a way to customize that startup, like being able to add like sysctl commands to enable V6?
There isn't currently, but I'm working on a PR that adds a config file loading mechanism for cluster creation where you can do more advanced things, and that's on the list of being able to add other commands.
Okay, and is there a way to do actions before the kubeadmin commands run?
Right now, you would have to go like edit the source code, but like there are phases to the boot, and I can insert something there to allow that to be configurable. I actually have something kind of nice. The nodes have an entry point that waits for a SIG user 1 signal. So they don't boot to systemd until it wants them to. So I take advantage of that to fix some mount stuff related to systemd in a container. We can insert other things there as well before we've booted any other processes. Which is also pretty nice for debugging because you can spin up one of these containers and it won't be doing anything. You can muck with it a bit and then you can send it a signal and it'll start actually booting. So I'm also planning to add some kind of like delayed boot flag where you can init the cluster but not boot, and then do whatever you want with it and then signal it to continue. And most of the hacks have turned out to not be too bad. There is a little bit of weirdness actually with systemd in a container. It works pretty well if it's not privileged. If it's a privileged container, then the systemd maintainers are like, why are you doing that? And I'm like, I know. But they're not too hard to get around, and it's so far worked pretty stably fine. I've tested this on a number of different systems, and I've reached out to a few folks that are interested, and so far it seems to mostly work. The biggest problem we've run into currently is we're using a temp file system for the Docker graph within the container, and turns out that defaults to being only a gig, which is kind of optimistic for storing images for Kubernetes. So we're going to need to make that configurable as well and bump the default.
If somebody wants to follow along with more development on the project, or if they want to give feedback, where should they do it?
TestInfra, it's in the kind directory. I have a to-do list file in the docs directory. It's sort of a, like, well, here's the things that we should be doing as we work on this. And then there's also kind of a like longer term wish list of these are maybe less feasible, but if someone wants to take a look, that'd be great. And as far as development, I've just added a label and I'm going to be tagging PRs and issues with area/kind, which is kind of hilarious.
Ben, I know there's been talk about moving other things out of the TestInfra repo, separating config from code. Is there any, in terms of all new tools being developed, is the TestInfra repo still the appropriate place for everything? I guess it's sort of an incubation area. I mean, these seems powerful enough that it might deserve its own repo.
Yeah, I think making new repos has more politics, but certainly
Sure.
moving this out at some point is something that I think ought to be done along with other tools in TestInfra. I wanted to, so today is the first time that I've wanted to actually show it to anyone and say, hey, look at this. This is a thing. I think probably requesting a repo is in the future. I want to make sure that it all makes sense and that it's actually differentiated enough. We have a number of projects related to clusters. In particular, there is one other project that is in a very similar space, sponsored by Cluster Lifecycle Nominally for local clusters with Hypercube and Docker. And
yeah, I was going to recommend that you sync up with TSC because I know the Cluster Lifecycle SIG, with what they're doing, it just seems like there's so many projects around exactly what you're doing right now. And anything that comes out of TestInfra is going to have sort of weight attached to it. So I think it would be good to.
I'm going to show it to that SIG at some point, and I've mentioned to them that I'm working in this, that I've been looking to work in this area, and they've been aware of the existing DIND project. This is pretty much just like a spiritual rewrite of the DIND directory in TestInfra. It follows all of the same expectations and proposal. Just the difference was because I did reference it, but kind of do a ground up rewrite, I was able to find like, oh, they're doing this weird thing related to systemd and no one has commented why they're doing it. And when I wrote this one, I put comments that's like, okay, we need to do this thing because systemd. Also because a number of the components use bash for booting in the DIND directory, and it's not super maintainable. So this one, the other goal is that this is actually a library, a set of libraries for build and for cluster creation and management, and the command line just wraps those libraries. So at some point, we might even try just having kubetest import those libraries instead of shelling out to yet another tool. Definitely requesting a Kubernetes SIG repo is something I've been mulling in the future. And I think we should probably do that with some of our other projects in TestInfra. I don't think it's necessarily a bad place for incubating, though, either. But I think that's more like SIG PM stuff or something. I'm also planning to, I think particularly the DIND cluster, the Kubernetes DIND cluster one, I'm probably going to write a couple of PRs to that with some things that I've found that I'm doing that I don't think they're doing that would make sense for their tool. Obviously, things like doing a completely different style of build and boot are not things that we're going to want to do between those projects. But we have already in the past passed along a few things related to, like, say, the actual Docker aspect. And I think we can work together on that.
It would be great if we had a spec. Sorry, I joined late. I saw the agenda then I wanted to jump on. It'd be great if we had a spec to rally the troops behind, like, the canonical reasons why we chose A versus B, because right now there's several incantations, like JetStack has one, and the DIN cluster was one that we sponsored, but we even sponsored it reluctantly because what we really wanted was a Go rewrite of what Mirantis had done.
So, sorry.
Go ahead.
I was going to say this actually sort of, I guess, meets that requirement then, and I actually have been talking with Munners has been a collaborator on this. He hasn't had time to write much code yet, but he's been very helpful with Vue, and they are intending to switch. In the past, they'd used Minikube, but they have kind of similar problems. They use Prow, and nested VMs and things are painful. So they'd like to use this. They've been using a fork of our previous DIN one. They intend to transition to this tool currently.
Yeah, so I think if we write a spec, I think you could probably bring a ton of people to the party here, because people have wanted this for a long time. Ideally, my grand unified field theory on this is that it would replace a bunch of test automation as well as the local up cluster goo, right?
Yeah, I've been talking to DIMS a little bit about this, not quite as much, because I also haven't wanted to distract anyone's time too much. I wasn't sure, like, initially a lot of it was just exploring feasibility of, like, how well does this actually work. I've just now gotten to the point where, like, I can actually do pretty decent builds in cluster boots, and it seems like something that I think is going to work pretty well, so I'd like to talk to more people about it starting this week.
There is a separate spec that we wrote for that for the sub-project, the Testing Commons one, where it overlaps a lot of the testing requirements that different folks have had into the client library requirements for initialization, right? And I think building a spec that building something that adheres to some of the principles that we kind of laid out there would be super useful for anybody, because the whole purpose, some of the reasons why we had written that spec is we wanted something that could be used by any third-party integrator that wasn't the overhead of a whole cluster, right? We wanted them to be able to, like, reference a library that auto spun up a localized DIN'd environment for their CI automation.
That's something I like as well. I think for some people, we might want to point them towards Minikube, though. There are some upsides, especially if you don't need to actually iterate on Kubernetes itself.
Yeah, Minikube. The problem with Minikube was the number of nodes, right? So the requirement was, like, you wanted to have a cluster of size n to be able to do your test automation.
Right. Well, I think we should be able to make that work really well. My goal, I'm reworking the configuration aspect, but the idea is there's a cluster package and there's a build package. And for anyone to consume this tooling, they can either consume that or they can consume the command line. So
Ben, I missed that last thing you said. You're reworking.
Config. I've since realized that you really need the config struct for cluster creation and not so much for everything else. So I'm splitting that up a bit and adding actual tooling for, like, specifying a more advanced configuration of, like, I want this many nodes and that sort of thing. Tim, could you link me to this spec you've been talking about?
Yeah.
Sure, it's a KEP. It's a KEP that's been put up for a while, so I'll link you to the KEP.
Okay, yeah, I would definitely like to involve that. Like I said, I've kind of skunked work this just to sort of suss things out and see how things work. But I think it's at the point where I think it's going to work. It gives us something in Go. It hopefully integrates pretty well. I'm trying to bring more and more people on board, but I did reach out to most of the people I could get in contact with. Most, not so much some of the other local cluster implementers, because I didn't want to say, hey, I want to replace your tool because I don't like it for these reasons. Instead, I want to say, hey, look, we want this for testing. Let's see if we can meet some of these other requirements we have.
Ben, if there's not a GitHub issue tracking the request for help for IPv6, I made a note in the notes that I'm sure Steve will assign to you in a second. Maybe there could be an issue to track that help request.
So there's actually some ongoing PRs. They use the Mirantis thing, and like we're fine with that. We want to get them going. The problem has been stuff like getting into workflow with the rest of test infra. Like kubetest changes are always kind of scary because kubetest is goop. And initially it was actually spinning up a VM and then booting a cluster on that. It was a lot more to track. I've been talking to PCM, who's on this call, about that, and also some to LeBlanc. LeBlanc? Oh, I'm sorry, I'm not sure how to pronounce that. I just know his GitHub handle, like most people. But Paul here can probably speak more to that.
Yeah, I'm from Cisco, so we're doing quite a bit of work with IPv6, and we're starting to get ready to do dual stack. So we've been using kubeadmin DIN cluster quite a bit for bringing up v6 clusters. We sort of took what Mirantis had and modified it so that it would work with IPv6. And now we're starting to look at it to see how we can modify it to work with dual stack. So I'm very interested in Kind as well, just to sort of see what it can do and see if there's a way we can leverage that as well. Because I really hate messing with the bash scripts.
I think everyone does. I think that's the problem, is like everyone wants this, but I think the desire, the resources to put behind it is limited.
Yeah, I didn't necessarily come out and say that, because I think that tool is really cool. They've built some really interesting functionality into it. Like they have this kind of cluster snapshot mechanism that gives you sort of a dump of the cluster state. It's really cool. But every extension of functionality to it involves adding more global environment variables. And I'd really like to eliminate that sort of thing from our testing. So this one's in Go. We specify config with like flags and YAML and JSON. Hopefully we can get that to a better state.
Cool. We're about 6 minutes over time, but Tim, since you're here, if you want to quickly talk about, I threw your registry overrides in here. I don't know if we have much to talk about.
There's the testing framework. Now that we have like the ability to get all of the test images isolated, one of the major things that's required is to plumb through an override for registry. This is for like air-gapped installations or air-gapped testing scenarios where people can only pull from private registries. So it's just we need to plumb through a couple of variables and knobs for the end-to-end testing framework. One of which is the registry override, and the second of which that I think we probably should have added a long time ago. We probably should have added both of these a long time ago. But the second of which is auto labeling of every workload that testing does and spins should probably be specified with its own label so that we can bulk delete things. Because right now it doesn't do that. And it's fine for the stuff that it's spun in test infra. It's terrible for running the stuff in the wild. Because if you're running in the wild, because things are randomized and not necessarily hierarchically organized, label provides you a unified means for you to delete all the stuff that the test apparatus spins.
I think the label idea is probably not super contentious. I did know there was some conversation as well about using a registry override for multi-arch testing. And one of the questions that I think came up was like, when a specific image is part of the test definition for a Kubernetes conformance test, like how does that play well with overriding the registry from which we're pulling it?
I think so long as the list of tests is the canonical list and it can be A/B compared from one to the other with expected results, that's all that really matters. Ideally, I would like to get like our version of the trimmed down test container pushed upstream. Kubekins, as we mentioned before in a different conversation, is a little bit conflating. It's got a bunch of test infra specific stuff in it. Mm-hmm. And ideally, consumers just want to have just the tests, just a test only container that contains the artifacts needed to reproduce conformance tests in the wild, right? We maintain this on our side. I talked with Matt Liggett a long time ago. We wanted to push it upstream, just no one ever found the time to do it.
If we could get some kind of proposal around that, I'd love to help with that. And I totally agree. Kubekins also includes like build tooling and other things that is a pretty large image. It's really more of our like base runtime for like deploying and building and testing clusters is really not appropriate for this. We should get an image that is just the tests.
Yeah, that was always the intent. And I think Matt filed an issue a long time ago when we first created the kube conformance container that we should push this into upstream, but we just never, it was one of those many things in the Kubernetes landscape that kind of falls on the floor, so.
Yeah, well, I'm willing to help with that. And I don't know when would be appropriate. I'd like to sync up on more testing stuff with this. I'm just going to be working on making it more usable right now, but I do think I'd like to increase collaboration, and I'm probably going to try to figure out, you know, if this gets to the point where we actually have some tests running and it looks good, or we should pull it out into a repo that's not test infra. I haven't figured out yet, like, who should own that or anything, but that's probably something that should happen in the near-ish future.
Tim, you mentioned you would like to get a trimmed down list of tests committed upstream. I wondered, I made a note, is this the same list discussed last week that Sonobui uses that does not include the flaky tests that we still use in kube tests? Is that the list, or is there some, I'm just totally off base here.
That's kind of it's a little bit of an overlapping topic. The Sonobui just adds a couple of extra filters on the tests. I would like it to be maintained upstream because I don't want to maintain it. The only reason that list was pruned was because there were issues that existed in the beginning, and some of those issues have been fixed. And it'd be nice if we just pushed all that stuff upstream and as the canonical source of truth for everybody.
There's also a slight orthogonal issue that we probably need some kind of test to avoid some of the things that we're having to filter out. Those tests should never have been allowed to be tagged conformance, which makes it so you need this filtering. Probably we want to have a discussion at some point around how we can prevent some of those. I think flaky is one of them, and we should never allow a test that's flaky to be called.
Yeah, that's what I remember from last week was the flaky tests.
Yeah, exactly.
But not everything. Yeah, go ahead.
The kube control client tests were all, or the kube control tests were all fixed. It's just that they couldn't originally run them introspectively. It didn't generate a kube config from in-cluster config. That stuff's been fixed since like 1.9. Dims and I fixed it. So there's no reason we can't unblock that stuff, but there's broader questions about like, should we allow aggregate level tests to be called conformance tests if we're going to eventually push things like kube control out of tree? So that's a broader question, but the idea of pushing a general container that contains the default variables for conformance and has a canonical skip list, which hopefully is 0, then you know I think it meets everybody's needs.
Definitely.
It would be interesting to see like what's being skipped that isn't already annotated in the E2E framework. You know, I guess they're calling out specific ones, but is there anything being skipped not based on a label, but like specific tests or specific patterns that aren't related to the predefined labels?
No, I mean, it's filtering out certain labels that are classes of things that probably should never have been marked. And then also the kubectl that you just talked about.
Yeah, so it sounds like there should probably be.
We've also updated the docs in most other places to mention that you should filter these when you're using other tools.
Sounds like there should be a design document that quickly outlines the point of the container and proposes publishing that with the Kubernetes releases. If people have to drop, we are over 10 minutes over time, so that's cool. I have to drop, which I think means I have to stop the recording, but if you guys want to keep talking in here, that's totally cool. So in that vein, thanks everyone for coming. We will see you all next week.
Thanks for hosting. See you.
Absolutely.
Thanks.